The world blurred in a whirl of light and noise. A screech, a deafening crash, and then, silence. My body felt weightless as if suspended in a void, but a sharp pain soon ripped through my head, dragging me back to a reality I barely recognized. When I opened my eyes, the sterile white of a hospital ceiling loomed overhead. The smell of disinfectant and the distant hum of medical machines filled the room. My head throbbed. The doctor's voice was a distant murmur as he explained my condition. "You suffered a severe head injury," he said. "Amnesia might be a side effect, but it's temporary. You'll recover soon." His words floated around me like leaves in the wind. Amnesia? The thought was as disorienting as the pain. A figure sat beside my bed. Her silhouette was familiar, yet I couldn't immediately place her. She looked at me with an expression that was hard to read, cold and distant. "Who are you?" I asked, half joking, testing the waters of this supposed memory loss. She hesitated. Her lips parted, and then came the words that left me colder than the fluid dripping into my veins. "We're just ordinary friends." I blinked, the words hitting me like a second accident. The phrase hung in the air, each syllable twisting like a knife. "Ordinary friends," I repeated, as if saying it aloud would make it less real. My throat tightened, and the casual, teasing response I had planned died before it could reach my lips. Her face gave nothing away. No humor, no warmth, not even a trace of concern. She glanced at her phone as if my injury and the situation were an inconvenience. "Now that you're awake," she said with a detached tone, "I'll head out. I've got work to do." I watched in stunned silence as she stood, adjusted her bag, and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, she turned back, perhaps out of a faint trace of guilt or obligation. "Rest well," she said, then disappeared into the corridor, leaving me with nothing but the beeping of the heart monitor and a bitter realization. Gabriella and I had been college sweethearts. We started dating during our sophomore year, a time filled with laughter, long nights, and dreams of a future together. After graduation, we moved south, both landing jobs at the top marketing firm in South City. Our lives seemed perfect, until they weren't. Office romances were frowned upon, so we agreed to keep our relationship a secret. At first, it was exciting, like living a double life. But as the years passed, the thrill faded, replaced by tension. For years later, we were both promoted to business managers, each leading competing teams. The stakes were higher, and our bond, once unshakable, began to crack under the pressure. Should we go public? I had asked her one night, the question hanging in the air between us. She'd brushed it off with a distracted laugh. "Let's not complicate things," she said. I told myself it was just a matter of timing, but deep down, doubt crept in. Were we still a couple? Or were we just two people clinging to a history that no longer existed? The doctor's words replayed in my mind. Gabriella knew I might be suffering from temporary memory loss, yet she'd looked me in the eye and said we were just friends. It wasn't confusion or panic that drove her response, it was indifference. She didn't care if I had forgotten her or if I would remember. Her reaction was cold, calculated, and it told me everything I needed to know. In that moment, I realized the truth. She'd probably wanted to end things long ago, but didn't have the courage to say it outright. And now, with my condition, she had her perfect doubt. As I lay in the hospital bed, flashes of our past played in my mind. The memories were vivid, almost cruel in their clarity. I remembered the late-night study sessions in college, the way she used to smile when we talked about our future, and the promises we made to each other. But those moments felt like relics from a different life. It wasn't just her words that haunted me, it was the subtle changes I'd ignored for months. The way she'd started staying late at work more often, her increasing disinterest in our conversations, and the way her phone seemed to hold more of her attention than I ever did. At first, I'd brushed it off as stress from work. Now, I wasn't so sure. And then there was Diego. Diego had joined her department a few months ago as an intern. He was tall, charismatic, and connected. According to HR gossip, Diego was the son of Pablo Lee, the owner of our company. A second-generation heir working under the guise of an ordinary employee. Gabriella had initially dismissed my concerns. "He's just a childish guy," she'd said. "Not my type at all." "You're overthinking it." I wanted to believe her, but the signs were hard to ignore. I'd logged into her old music account one evening, a shared relic from our college days. We'd spend hours curating playlists together, pouring our hearts into songs that spoke of love, dreams, and us. But when I checked her account, the playlist she'd named after me was gone. In its place was a new list filled with Korean pop songs, songs Diego frequently shared on his social media. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe she was just keeping up with trends. Maybe I was being paranoid. But the doubt festered, growing with every unanswered text, every missed call, and every social media post that hinted at a connection between them. The beeping of the heart monitor brought me back to the present. My head ached, not just from the injury but from the weight of everything that had happened. Gabriella's words played on a loop in my mind. Ordinary friends. No, I thought. We're not friends. We're not anything anymore. As the door opened and a nurse walked in, I forced a smile. If Gabriella wanted to pretend our relationship never existed, then maybe it was time I did the same. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover, secrets lurking beneath the surface, waiting to come to light. And I wasn't leaving this story unfinished. The game had just begun. 3 days passed before the hospital finally discharged me. By then, I'd settled into a quiet, brooding acceptance of my situation. Gabriella's absence over those days didn't surprise me. She hadn't visited, not even once. Instead, she sent a bouquet of cappuccino-colored flowers with a generic note, "Get well soon." Holding them, I felt a twinge of bitter irony. The flowers might have been more meaningful if they weren't delivered by the hospital's front desk staff, like an afterthought. I stared at the bouquet in my hands, the scent of the blooms faint and forgettable. With a sigh, I tossed them into the trash bin by my bed. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. When I called Gabriella to let her know I was being discharged, she took an unusually long time to answer. "Hello," she said, her tone clipped, almost as if my call had interrupted something. "Hey, Gabriella," I said softly, trying to suppress the growing frustration in my voice. "I'm being discharged today. Do you have time to pick me up?" There was a pause. It stretched so long that I thought the call had dropped. Finally, she spoke. "I'm really busy, Daniel. I can't get away right now," she said, the words devoid of guilt or hesitation. "Should I call a car for you?" "What are you busy with?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. Inside, though, my patience was fraying. I knew her work schedule, her current project had wrapped up, and this was supposed to be the quietest period for her team. Another pause. Then, a curt, "Just, things. I'll text you the number for a car service, okay?" I sighed and hung up. There was no point in arguing. Her priorities were clear, and I wasn't one of them. As I waited in the hospital lobby for the car service she'd arranged, a man approached me. He was in his early 40s, dressed in a crisp suit, and carried himself with an air of quiet authority. "Mr. Mu?" he asked politely. I nodded, slightly taken aback. "Yes?" "I'm the one who brought you here after the accident," he explained, his tone apologetic. "I'm sorry for what happened." "The driver, well, we've handled it, and all your medical bills have been covered. These flowers," he gestured to the trash bin where the cappuccino-colored bouquet sat discarded. "They were from me as well. I hope you'll accept my sincerest apologies." For a moment, I stared at him in stunned silence. The flowers weren't even from Gabriella? The realization was like a cold slap to the face. I forced a polite smile and shook his hand. "Thank you for your kindness," I said, though the words felt hollow. The ride home was uneventful, but my mind churned with thoughts. Memories of Gabriella and me, the good ones, and the bad, played like a slideshow in my head. I remembered the night we graduated and sat on the steps of our dorm, making promises about our future. "We'll build a life together," she had said, her voice filled with conviction. What had changed? When had we drifted so far apart that she could so easily dismiss me as ordinary? When I arrived home, I wasn't surprised to find her already there. She sat on the sofa, her phone in hand, a faint smile on her lips as she texted someone. The sight of her, so calm and content, struck a nerve. It was the kind of smile I hadn't seen her direct at me in months. "You're back," she said, glancing up briefly before returning to her phone. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but firm. She looked up again, this time with a flicker of hesitation. I sat down across from her, studying her face. The woman I'd fallen in love with was still there, the same sharp features, the same bright eyes, but something vital was missing. "Are we still together?" I asked bluntly. Her reaction was subtle, but telling. Her gaze dropped, and she fidgeted with her hands. "Daniel, I think we've both known for a while that things haven't been the same." I nodded, though the words stung. "So that's it? 7 years, and you can't even give me a straight answer?" "It's not that simple," she said, her voice rising slightly. "We've grown apart. You know that as well as I do." "Have we grown apart, Gabriella? Or have you moved on?" I asked, my tone sharper now. "Is it Diego?" Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, she looked genuinely taken aback. Then, she sighed. "Daniel, Diego is just a colleague." I laughed bitterly. "A colleague? Gabriella, I'm not blind. I see the way you look at him. The way you," I trailed off, shaking my head. "You don't even bother hiding it anymore." She didn't deny it. Instead, she looked at me with a mixture of frustration and pity. "Why are you doing this?" "Why now?" "Because I need to know the truth," I said, my voice firm. "I'm done pretending everything's fine. If you don't want to be with me, just say it." She was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, she said the words I'd been dreading. "You're right. I don't want to be with you anymore." The room fell silent, the weight of her confession settling like a heavy fog. I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with heartbreak. At least now, there were no more lies. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed our conversation in my head. The Gabriella I had loved was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. And yet, a part of me couldn't let go. Not yet. I didn't know what my next move would be, but one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let this end without understanding why it had all fallen apart. The cracks in our relationship had become chasms, and I was determined to uncover what lay at the bottom. 3 days after our conversation, Gabriella moved out. She packed her belongings methodically, her every action calculated, as if this were just another task on her to-do list. I didn't try to stop her. I sat on the sofa, watching in silence, my chest heavy but my mind numb. Words seemed pointless now. "Do you need any help?" I asked flatly as she struggled to close an overstuffed suitcase. She glanced at me, hesitated, and then shook her head. "No. I've got it." Her response was polite, distant, like we were strangers, not two people who had shared 7 years of their lives together. She didn't look back when she finally walked out the door. For a moment, I thought that was the end of it. But endings, I've learned, are rarely that clean. They're messy, tangled with loose ends and unanswered questions. And for all the clarity Gabriella had given me with her confession, there was still one question burning in my mind: Diego. At work, things were awkward. Gabriella and I had always been careful to keep our relationship private, but breakups have a way of leaving their mark. Our colleagues noticed the tension, the way we avoided each other during meetings, or the way her laughter seemed forced when I was nearby. But it wasn't Gabriella who made things unbearable. It was Diego. He'd always been a confident, charismatic presence in the office, but now, he seemed emboldened. He'd swagger past my desk, flashing me a smirk that made my blood boil. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. But then there were the comments, subtle digs that only I would understand. "Tough week, Daniel?" he'd ask, his tone laced with mock sympathy. "Must be hard juggling so much at once." Or, "Gabriella's really been on fire lately, hasn't she? She's so driven." I wanted to confront him, to wipe that smug grin off his face, but I knew better. Diego wasn't just an intern. He was Pablo Lee's son, the heir to the company. Any confrontation would only make me look bad. So, I kept my head down and focused on my work. But even as I buried myself in spreadsheets and project deadlines, I couldn't shake the feeling that Diego was more than just a passing infatuation for Gabriella. There was something deeper, something calculated. The confirmation came one afternoon when I overheard two colleagues talking near the break room. "Did you see Gabriella and Diego's posts last night?" one of them asked. "Yeah," the other replied, lowering her voice. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore. Did you see the caption on Diego's photo? 'Victory in every battle.' What does that even mean?" "It's a reference to their project," the first one said. "But still, they're practically flaunting their relationship. Poor Daniel. He must be so embarrassed." I froze, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. Gabriella and Diego's relationship wasn't just office gossip anymore. It was public. And while I'd suspected it for weeks, hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. That evening, I went home and poured myself a glass of whiskey. The apartment felt emptier than ever. Gabriella's absence was palpable, her side of the bed untouched, her favorite mug missing from the kitchen cabinet. But it wasn't her absence that gnawed at me. It was the lies. For 7 years, we'd built a life together. Or so I thought. Now, it felt like that life had been a facade, a house of cards, toppled by the slightest breeze. And at the center of it all was Diego. I picked up my phone and opened Gabriella's old music account. It had been weeks since I'd last logged in, but curiosity got the better of me. Her recent listening history was still filled with Korean pop songs, Diego's favorite genre. The playlist she'd once created for me, the one filled with love songs and shared memories, was gone, replaced by tracks that felt alien and impersonal. I scrolled through her profile, searching for something, anything that might explain how we'd ended up here. And then I found it, a comment she'd left on one of Diego's posts. "Eat quickly. Take care of your stomach." It was a simple, seemingly innocuous message, but it hit me like a slap. Those were the exact words she used to say to me during our late-night study sessions in college, when we'd survive on instant noodles and sheer determination. It was a small thing, but it felt like she'd taken a piece of our history and given it to someone else. The next morning, I arrived at work with a renewed sense of purpose. If Gabriella and Diego wanted to flaunt their relationship, that was their choice. But I wasn't going to let them walk all over me. I'd worked too hard to get where I was, and I wasn't about to let their actions derail my career. The first opportunity came during a team meeting. Gabriella presented her team's latest project, a marketing campaign for a high-profile client. Her presentation was polished, as always, but I noticed a flaw in her data analysis, a small oversight that could have significant implications for the client's budget. "Gabriella," I said, raising my hand. "I noticed an inconsistency in your projections. Have you accounted for the recent changes in market trends?" She hesitated, her confident demeanor faltering for a split second. I believe we have, but I'll double-check the numbers." I'd recommend doing that, I said evenly. It's important to ensure our data is accurate before presenting it to the client. Diego, who was sitting across the table, shot me a glare. But I ignored him. This wasn't about petty revenge. It was about holding my ground and proving that I wasn't going to be sidelined. After the meeting, Bella, a junior colleague I'd mentored, approached me. "Daniel, that was amazing," she said, her eyes wide with admiration. "The way you handled that, you were so composed." I smiled, though it felt hollow. "Thanks, Bella. Just doing my job." But inside, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was regaining control. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, one thing was clear: I wasn't going to let Gabriella and Diego dictate my story. That night, as I sat in the dim light of my apartment, I made a decision. Gabriella and Diego could have their games, their secrets, and their lies. But I had something far more valuable: the truth. And it was time to use it. The unraveling had only just begun. The days following the team meeting were a whirlwind of activity, and I threw myself into my work with a single-minded focus. If Gabriella and Diego thought they could undermine me, they were wrong. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me falter. Yet, even as I poured my energy into my projects, a nagging sense of unfinished business lingered in the back of my mind. The pieces of the puzzle weren't adding up. Gabriella had always been ambitious, but her recent actions seemed more calculated than driven. And Diego, with his smug confidence, clearly knew something I didn't. It was time to find out what. One evening, as I was leaving the office, Bella approached me with a worried expression. "Daniel, do you have a minute?" she asked, glancing around to make sure no one was within earshot. "Of course," I said, motioning for her to follow me to a quiet corner of the lobby. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated, biting her lip. "I overheard something today, something about Gabriella and Diego. I thought you should know." My stomach tightened. "What did you hear?" "They were talking in the break room," she said, lowering her voice. "Diego was bragging about how he's going to secure the director position once Albert leaves. And Gabriella, she didn't say much, but she didn't deny it either. It's like they already know it's a done deal. The director position. It was the most coveted role in our department, and one I'd worked tirelessly to be considered for. Hearing that Diego and Gabriella might have already claimed it behind closed doors felt like a betrayal of everything I'd stood for. "Thanks for telling me, Bella," I said, forcing a smile, despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I'll handle it." Later that night, I sat in my apartment, replaying Bella's words in my mind. If Diego and Gabriella thought they could manipulate their way to the top, they clearly underestimated me. I'd spent years building my reputation in this company, and I wasn't about to let them destroy it. I opened my laptop and logged into the company's internal network. As a business manager, I had access to project files, performance reports, and team evaluations. It wasn't long before I found what I was looking for: Gabriella's recent project data. Her numbers were good, too good. The projections she'd submitted for her team's latest campaign were almost suspiciously flawless. And then I noticed something odd: a discrepancy in the dates of her data entries. It seemed minor at first, but the more I dug, the more I realized it was anything but. Gabriella had backdated several entries to make it appear as though her team's campaign had been performing better than it actually was. It was a subtle manipulation, but one that could easily sway upper management's opinion in her favor. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. This wasn't just about Diego or the director position anymore. Gabriella was playing a dangerous game, and if I didn't act carefully, I could end up being collateral damage. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Albert, the current director. He was set to transfer to the Nanjing branch in a few weeks, but for now, he still held significant influence in the department. "Daniel, good to see you," Albert said as I stepped into his office. What can I do for you? I wanted to discuss something important, I said, handing him a folder containing the evidence I'd gathered. It's about Gabriella's recent project. Albert flipped through the pages, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. This is concerning, he said, looking up at me. Are you sure about this? Absolutely, I replied. I've double-checked the data. If you need further verification, I'd be happy to assist. He nodded, setting the folder aside. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Daniel. I'll look into it immediately. As I left his office, I felt a mix of relief and anticipation. The ball was in Albert's court now, and I could only hope he'd take the necessary steps to address the issue. 2 days later, an email from Albert landed in my inbox. He'd launched an internal audit of Gabriella's project and discovered additional discrepancies. The matter had been escalated to upper management, and Gabriella was temporarily suspended pending further investigation. The news spread through the office like wildfire. Gabriella's once untouchable reputation was in shambles, and Diego's smug demeanor had all but vanished. He avoided me in the hallways, his confidence replaced by a palpable tension. But I wasn't done yet. With Gabriella sidelined, Diego became my next focus. His position in the company was tenuous at best, and in turn with no real authority outside of his family name. Yet, he'd managed to cultivate an air of influence that left many colleagues wary of crossing him. One afternoon, I called a meeting with my team to discuss an upcoming campaign. Diego, ever the opportunist, had inserted himself into the project, claiming he could offer valuable insights from his marketing background. As we reviewed the campaign strategy, Diego interjected with a suggestion that was not only impractical but also wildly out of budget. That's an interesting idea, I said, keeping my tone neutral. But have you considered the financial implications? Implementing this would require reallocating resources from other critical areas. Diego faltered, clearly unprepared for the pushback. Well, I just thought it could be worth exploring. Exploration is important, I said, meeting his gaze. But so is practicality. Let's focus on strategies that align with our budget and timeline. The rest of the team nodded in agreement, and Diego's influence diminished before my eyes. It was a small victory, but a satisfying one nonetheless. That evening, as I left the office, I received a message from Bella. Diego's been asking questions about you, she wrote. Be careful. I stared at the message, a sense of unease settling over me. Diego wasn't the type to go down without a fight, and I had no doubt he'd try to retaliate. But I wasn't afraid. I'd come too far to back down now. As I walked home, the city lights flickering around me, I resolved to see this through to the end. Gabriella and Diego had underestimated me, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. The turning point had arrived, and I was ready for whatever came next. The morning after Bella's warning, I arrived at the office with a sense of resolve. Gabriella's suspension had left the department in a state of uncertainty, but I knew that the chaos presented an opportunity, one I couldn't afford to waste. Diego was still a looming threat, but his confidence was shaken. It was time to tip the scales entirely. That day, I scheduled a meeting with Pablo Lee, the company's owner and Diego's father. It was a bold move, one that carried risks, but I had spent years earning a reputation as a dependable and results-driven manager. If there was ever a time to leverage that trust, it was now. Pablo's office was as imposing as the man himself, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and an air of understated luxury. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a curious expression. Daniel, what brings you here? He asked, gesturing for me to take a seat. Thank you for meeting with me, Mr. Lee, I began, choosing my words carefully. I wanted to discuss some concerns I have about recent developments in the department. His brow furrowed slightly. Go on. I outlined the situation, presenting the evidence I had gathered about Gabriella's misconduct and highlighting Diego's inappropriate behavior. I kept my tone professional, focusing on the impact their actions had on the team and the company as a whole. Pablo listened intently, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You've given me a lot to think about, Daniel," he said after a long pause. "I appreciate your honesty and your dedication to the company. Rest assured, I will address this matter personally." His response was measured, but I could sense a shift in his demeanor. He wasn't just listening, he was calculating his next move. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. The fallout was swift and decisive. A week later, an internal memo announced that Gabriella's suspension had been made permanent. Her position was terminated due to unethical practices, and an external candidate was being brought in to replace her. As for Diego, his downfall came in the form of a quiet but effective demotion. Pablo had stripped him of his responsibilities, relegating him to a minor role that offered little influence. The news sent ripples through the office, and Diego's smug demeanor all but disappeared. He avoided me entirely, his once confident stride reduced to a subdued shuffle. With Gabriella and Diego out of the picture, the department began to stabilize. Projects moved forward smoothly, and the tension that had plagued the office lifted. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. But the victory was bittersweet. Gabriella's betrayal had left a scar, and though I had uncovered the truth, it didn't erase the pain of losing someone I had once loved deeply. As I sat in my office, reviewing the final details of a new campaign, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had transpired. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected message from Gabriella. It was short and to the point. "Can we meet?" I hesitated before replying. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to let the silence speak for itself. But another part of me, the part that sought closure, agreed to meet. We met at a small cafe near the office, a neutral space where neither of us held the upper hand. Gabriella looked different. Not physically, but in her demeanor. The confidence that once defined her was replaced by something quieter, almost regretful. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down across from her. I nodded, waiting for her to speak. She fiddled with her coffee cup, avoiding my gaze. "I owe you an apology," she began. "For everything. I made mistakes, Daniel. I let my ambition cloud my judgment, and I hurt you in the process." Her words were sincere, but they felt hollow. An apology couldn't undo the past. "Why now?" I asked, my tone even. "Why apologize after everything has already fallen apart?" She looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and sadness. "Because I needed to. I needed to tell you that I'm sorry, and that I hope you can move on." I studied her for a moment, searching for any trace of the woman I had once loved. But the Gabriella sitting before me was a stranger, a reflection of choices that had led her down a path I could no longer follow. "I already have," I said finally, my voice firm but not unkind. "I hope you can do the same." She nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "Take care, Daniel." "You too," I replied, and with that, she walked away, leaving me alone at the table. In the weeks and months that followed, I focused on rebuilding. I threw myself into my work, strengthening my team and embracing new challenges. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about trust, resilience, and the importance of standing up for myself. Gabriella and Diego became distant memories, their influence fading as time went on. The scars they left behind remained, but they no longer defined me. I had found my footing again, and for the first time in a long time I felt at peace. Life, I realized, wasn't about holding on to the past. It was about moving forward, one step at a time. And that was exactly what I intended to do.